Zack's in Manchester. Zack, what would you like to say?
A little bit nervous, first time caller.
It's only me.
So go easy. Very good. I just think it's a bad idea because if you're trying to attract investors and wealthy people who are going to create businesses and invest, it's going to turn them off. And two, if you think about like assets, it can go up and down in value quite quickly. So say if you had a stock portfolio that was worth 12 million and then it got valued at that, and then 2 months later the stock market crashed and then it was worth 9 million, are you going to give people a refund then on the tax they paid potentially 2 weeks earlier?
No, because they paid it on wealth. They paid it on wealth that they had, and then they won't be required to pay it on wealth that they don't have.
Yeah, but that wealth that they had could then be worth a lot less. Versus when you get,
and then they won't have to pay, and then they won't have to pay tax on it because it won't be wealth. It won't be the same level of wealth. It's why you have a threshold.
Yeah, but that's value.
Tell me about the people who've got £10 million in liquid assets who would think, right, I'm definitely not opening a business in that country because I might be required to pay 2% on anything above that figure that I end up with. I mean, what makes that? I'm going to go out on a limb and say you're not one of them.
No, definitely not one of them.
And are you ever likely to be one of them?
Probably not.
So who told you that they would hate this idea so much? I mean, because you look at a country in which you're going to set up a company, and just off the top of my head, you're going to need roads, you're going to need a workforce, you're going to need an educated workforce, you're going to need an educated workforce with a health service, you're going to need transport infrastructure, you're going to need... I could go on. You're going to need a bloody army. You're going to need a police force to make sure that all your stuff doesn't get nicked. You're going to need a fire service in case your business, your office, your factory catches fire. Where do you get the idea that these people are going to be put off by the notion that they would be required to pay a bit for it?
Well, you see in the UK, people, the millionaires are leaving massively.
That's a very, very questionable piece of research or pieces of research undertaken largely by companies that are dedicated to protecting the interests of the super wealthy. So, I mean, we can park that for the time being because the kind of people punting that in the British media are also the kind of people who pretend to be patriots. If you don't want to be in this country, then sayonara. Don't let the door hit you on the backside on the way out. But where do you get these ideas from? You, Zack, in Manchester, someone who's never in a billion years going to be required to pay a wealth tax, is somehow on the side of people who don't think that they should. Because guess who pays for the infrastructure if they don't, Zack?
People like me. But if you look at the FTSE 100, you've got companies leaving left, right, and centre. That's because of Brexit. That's because of Brexit. That's got absolutely nothing to do with income tax. The reason why people are doing it is because companies are valued a lot less if they're based in the UK versus the US, and one of those reasons.
So, okay, you're still not answering my question about where you get your information from. But let me ask you, why do you think the media?
Well, that's one source.
Why
is that you see?
Why do you think the media that is railing against? Hang on a second. Why do you think the media that rails against the wealth tax was also in favour of Brexit?
Well, I'm not media.
But all your information has come from the media, including these dodgy surveys about billionaires supposedly leaving the country. So why do you think the people who've persuaded you the wealth tax is a bad idea also put huge amounts of effort in trying to persuade the country to leave the European Union? And companies aren't leaving. I mean, that's just factually, observably untrue.
Well, AstraZeneca is looking at leaving the UK.
AstraZeneca, it has been reported, is thinking about relisting somewhere else for a whole heap of reasons, none of which are linked to a non-existent wealth tax or even changes to national insurance. But, I mean, that's why I'm interested in where you think you're getting your information from. But answer the Brexit question first.
Well, the right-wing media like Brexit for, I don't know, a whole host of reasons, deregulation and making things easier. I don't know. I mean, I'm not talking about Brexit. You asked me about
you kind of
why do I think the wealth?
Because you were talking about companies. You were talking about companies actually leaving. Well, actually, no. You were talking about a country thinking about leaving the country.
No. Where they list their stocks. Okay.
And that's been more heavily impacted by Brexit than it has been by a non-existent wealth tax.
No. It's because a stock it tends to be higher if it moves over to the US. They're not moving to Europe. They're moving to the US.
What's this got to do with the wealth tax?
The reason, got to do with the wealth tax. The reason why people are doing it is because companies are valued a lot less if they're based in the UK versus the US. They're not moving to Europe. They're moving to the US. because one type of wealth is stocks and shares, right? That's a very liquid asset. You can own stocks in a company, but probably worth £12 million.
Yeah.
But if you own it in the FTSE, it'll be then subject to this wealth tax that you're talking about.
Right.
Versus if you own it in the Nasdaq, which then it wouldn't be. So that's another reason to take money out of the US stock market.
But it would be. It would still be your asset.
What? If you're a US investor, it wouldn't be. You just think, I'll just put it in the UK. In the US.
No, they've changed the law on that. It's got them into quite a lot of trouble. They would be taxed on that here.
What if you're in the UK?
If it's your earnings, your assets, you are a British person with assets, and the assets would be taxed. Your liquid assets would be taxed. Of course, your portfolio would be included in that.
But we're talking about if you're an international investor and you want to move around.
We're talking about British citizens paying We're talking about British taxpayers paying a wealth tax.
We're talking about why millionaires are leaving the UK.
Well, I'm not persuaded that they are. Where did you get that information from?
What?
Do you know any?
There's various sources.
Do you know any?
Do I know any millionaires that left the UK? I don't know any millionaires at all, to be honest.
But here you are, sticking up for them.
I'm sticking up for Britain because ultimately, what is it? Something like the top 1% or 10% pay 25% of the overall tax.
What does that tell you about wealth distribution?
That they're paying, a broad amount of it. So I'd rather...
No, wealth distribution. What does that tell you about wealth distribution?
I don't know.
All right, shall I tell you?
Some people are very wealthy.
Yeah. So what can we do about that to make the country fairer?
But is it about making the country fairer, or is it about making everyone better off?
No, it's about making the country fairer. So if you've got a tiny, tiny number of people who are inconceivably wealthy, and the country doesn't really feel as if it is a place where everybody is being properly looked after, what might you do to address that inequality or that completely unfair distribution of wealth? Because I love the point you make about the tiny percentage of people paying a disproportionate amount of tax, because that's proof of the problem that we're trying to solve. It's not something you offer up as a reason why we shouldn't try to solve the problem. You want to live in a country where the tax burden is shared a lot more equally, because earnings are much higher outside of that tiny percentile, don't you?
Or if you bring more wealthy people in, you create more businesses that will generate more tax. To me, it's not a question about having a fair distribution of wealth.
No.
It's about raising the bottom of the bar.
So what you've got to do is you've got to find the richest people, and give them every single thing they want and ask for. Otherwise, they're going to leave the country and take all their money with them.
I don't think it's a case of giving them everything they ask for, but I think it's a case of not making the economy like Cuba or Zimbabwe, where they forcibly try and...
When did they introduce a wealth tax in Zimbabwe?
I don't know, but wherever the...
Why did you mention Cuba?
Where it worked. Because, that's a country that's played with...
I'll ask you again. What are your main sources for your economic opinions, do you think?
Research, internet, university.
Okay.
Yeah.